I'm delighted to be joined today by Christopher Rufo, or as Gavin Newsom calls him, one of the greats, Christopher Rufo. He is the author of the Christopher Rufo Substack, and he works for the Manhattan Institute as well. Christopher, I think for our British listeners and viewers, they probably know two things about Gavin Newsom. One is that he's been a pretty disastrous governor of California, and his career is tainted with all sorts of problems. And the second is that he is very likely, or seems very likely, if you look at betting markets and polls and so on, to be he is a leading contender to be the next Democratic presidential nominee. And those things should really be incongruous, but they are not.
Yeah, well, Freddie, that's a great question. And it's the perpetual question of California politics and to a certain extent, national politics. You have people who run on disastrous records that seems to be then totally separated from their political popularity. I think it could be explained by a couple things. First off, what I'm seeing in California is that, yes, Gavin Newsom's record is disastrous. There's fraud, corruption, mismanagement, kind of insanity, adoption of positions that for many other politicians would seem to be very toxic. But it's not really clear that California voters know that or feel that way, even if they have the facts at their disposal. And so my sense is that the left and the Democratic Party in particular has become so ideological in the last 5, 6 years that it's no longer looking at politics in the traditional terms of good government. Did we spend money? Is government effective? Did we do this efficiently? Do we have kind of good government? And so I think Gavin Newsom benefits tremendously from that. And then the second consideration is that politics is at the end of the day, national politics is a team sport. There's two teams, they face off, there's one winner. And so Democrats are looking around and trying to understand the lessons of the last three election cycles. You can't run Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden can only win under conditions of COVID lockdowns. And then Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, are going to get blown out. And whatever his record is, Gavin Newsom looks like an American president. He talks like an American president. He has a kind of charisma and a slick quality that used to be attributed to politicians like Bill Clinton, that he can kind of, even when he talks, he's always kind of moving his head like this. And so he's always kind of bobbing and weaving and trying to, not let anyone land a blow. And that's for a politician, a pretty valuable skill.
I've noticed the gestures. They're extraordinary. He does the most amazing gestures that look deeply irritating to me, but seem to work for a lot of people. And I have heard it said, just on a looks, I've heard online streamers say that he mogs J.D. Vance, meaning he's better looking than J.D. Vance. And therefore, just on that criterion, he could win the presidency.
Look, I mean, I love JD Vance. No shade on JD, but yeah, Gavin Newsom is he's charismatic, he's well spoken, he's articulate, he's a handsome guy, and that goes a long way. I mean, the most famous example is the Kennedy Nixon race of 1960, where radio listeners voted in favor of Nixon. They liked his substance. They liked his argumentation. Nixon was a brilliant debater, but TV viewers heavily favored John F. Kennedy, who was young, handsome, attractive. And so, we joke about these things, but in fact, and Trump himself has this instinct. There's a thing that Trump always does that people find mystifying, but I actually think is quite intelligent. He says, "Oh, this is a guy out of central casting," meaning in the old Hollywood system, you'd have a central casting office. They'd have all these actors on the wall. And they say, this guy looks like a cop. This guy looks like a president. This guy looks like a corrupt senator. And actually what you look like, or what you become to look like over time as you age, as you have experiences, in some ways is a reflection of what you're optimized for. And there might be an evolutionary reason, who knows? But in politics, you really shouldn't underestimate the appearance of, appearance versus reality. Yeah, appearance actually does matter. It shouldn't be ignored. That's something that we've known for a long time.
Before we go on, a word from our sponsors, Monetary Metals. What if your gold could actually earn more gold without you ever selling it? That's the idea behind Monetary Metals, a company changing the way investors think about gold ownership. For decades, owning gold meant paying storage fees and hoping the price went up. But Monetary Metals lets you put your gold to productive use through their gold leasing marketplace, earning up to 4% yield on gold paid in actual gold ounces, not dollars, more gold. So you maintain exposure to gold's long-term purchasing power while increasing the amount of metal you own over time. In a world dealing with inflation, debt expansion, and financial instability, that's a very different approach to wealth preservation. Thousands of investors are no longer relying solely on gold price appreciation. They've become Monetary Metals clients to accumulate more ounces of gold. Learn how to earn yield on gold paid in gold at monetary-metals.com/Americano. Well, you mentioned Kamala Harris, and she is another figure who became the Democratic presidential nominee despite a disastrous record. And that she and Newsom both grew out of California politics at the same time. And perhaps you could shed a bit of light on California politics and why it does seem to be this cauldron for producing pretty terrible leaders, Democratic leaders, is it because it is such a solidly Democratic state that Democrat politics has become corrupt and just rolls on?
It's a great question, and there's an additional nuance that might be very interesting, in particular for UK listeners. And it's not just that California produced these figures of the top of the Democratic power structure. Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris, also Nancy Pelosi, of course, who ran the House of Representatives for the Democrats for decades. It's not that they're just coming from California, but they're just coming from a very small radius, maybe 25 square mile radius in Northern California's Bay Area. San Francisco, Oakland, you kick it out to Silicon Valley. It's a triangle that is fairly small. And it's producing all of these people, San Francisco in particular, this very small city, fewer than 1 million people. And this, I grew up in California, and this is always the way it has been. It's changing now, but in the sense that the Northern California, San Francisco Democratic political machine was always the basis of idea generation. You have University of California, Berkeley down there. You have San Francisco politics, which is always, historically some of the most left-wing politics. And then you had a series of families, including the Getty family that Gavin Newsom is deeply connected with, Pelosi's family. You have Daniel Lurie, the current mayor of San Francisco, his family. You have a kind of native aristocracy in San Francisco, and they're able to have patronage. They're able to cultivate leaders. They're able to find people that have the appearance of kind of political ambition, raw material of political success. And someone like Kamala Harris, you say, well, this is someone coming from way outside. Well, the powers that be in Northern California had anointed Willie Brown, the very colorful, kind of exciting legislator in previous years, 40 years ago. And of course, he took Kamala Harris under his wing. Well, he took Kamala Harris a couple of different ways under his wing, but let's just keep it PG-13. He kind of brought her into the fold. And so Northern California's Bay Area created a left-wing political aristocracy that is still at now the height of power nationally. And that's something that a lot of people don't know, few people discuss, but I think it's a really important dynamic.
And it is that aristocracy that you're talking about that generated, that West Coast aristocracy that generated a lot of what you might call elite woke politics. And perhaps the kind of crossover with Hollywood helps there because it's they hang around in the same circles, they're endorsed by celebrities and so on. And it seems to be a self-perpetuating machine.
That's right. Absolutely. And so the political map has shifted. When I was growing up, Southern California was considered non-political or apolitical in an ideological sense. They had machine politics, they had corruption, they had politics, of course. But it was never as intellectual or as ideological as Northern California. That's starting to change. And in the woke era, these things really merged together. And people who are running these institutions, a couple things happened all at once. First, you have one party rule for now 16 years. After Arnold Schwarzenegger left office, Democrats have controlled the entire political system in California. Second, you have the merging of the intellectual politics from Northern California with the entertainment politics of Southern California. This is a tremendously powerful combination. And third, you have the absence of any check on their power, because the Dems in California have consolidated their power by flooding their NGOs with billions of dollars in public funds, flooding their unions with billions of dollars in public funds, flooding the education system with billions of dollars in public funds, and then changing the election laws over time so that they have an enormous electoral advantage just built into the law, built into the system. And what happens with that is that there's no rightward bound. So the center of gravity is no longer, we have to appeal to moderates in order to defeat Republicans. The center of gravity becomes leftward, and meaning that it's a competition for who can go further left and win a Democratic primary. And then that becomes the focal of competition because of how they change the election laws. And so as a consequence, we've done these stories, and some of which you may have seen. Gavin Newsom is giving free sex change surgeries to transgender migrants. Gavin Newsom is giving free solar panels to illegal aliens. Gavin Newsom is doing, you go down the list, all of these insane policies that on the surface you'd say, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't serve any interest. It's not popular with voters. But you have to understand it's popular with the people who run the machine in California. And that's really what determines it. And so if we're talking about Gavin Newsom, the question becomes this. He's figured out how to navigate the machine in California. But as he tries to jump to national politics, will some of these issues hurt him? Will his record start to matter more than it does in his local environment?
Well, I wanted to go through some of the stories you've done recently about Gavin Newsom, because you're on a tremendous crusade, and more power to your elbow on that front. But one of the striking stories we've seen was this gay certification story, which is was it $660 million fund that had to be given to gay-owned businesses. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So the California Governor's Office and Utilities Commission are pressuring public utilities, well, semi-public utilities. We call them public utilities, but these are really public-private firms that provide electricity for California. There's one called Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, huge provider, mega billion-dollar company that is regulated by the state. And so because of this relationship, in recent years, they've increased this what is an affirmative action quota. Now they're saying you need to give 1.5% of all of your contracts to outside companies to California gay certified businesses. And so the number keeps going up. And then if you don't do it, they have all sorts of techniques to kind of bully you into compliance. But if you total that number up, it's about $633 million that they're trying to push towards gay-owned firms. And I mean, affirmative action is wrong. Businesses should be treated equally according to the quality of their businesses. Certainly, a business shouldn't be penalized for the race of their owner, the orientation of their owner, et cetera, on public contracts. But what's really interesting about this story is we did a deep dive. We said, well, how does a business get gay certified? How do you get official state gay certification? And the documentation was quite interesting. You had to have a letter from your doctor, so a letter from your doctor certifying you as gay, 3 letters of reference with people willing to, vouch for you as gay, an award from a gay nonprofit group. So if you're a top dog there, and I called them on the phone and I said, hey, look, I have a small company. I really want to get these contracts. I'm a straight man married to a woman, but I'd be willing to say that I'm 1% gay in order to qualify for these contracts. Would I qualify? And the one on the other line said, no one has ever asked us that. We have a team of experts, that will judge your application. So as long as you're authentically you, things should work out the way they work out. And of course, I didn't submit the application because on the last page of this application, there was a big red warning. And it says, if you lie about this on your application, you could face up to 1 year in prison. So I said, well, you know what? I may not be gay enough for California's gay certification. I'm not going to take the risk. I don't want to go to prison. And so we had fun with it. But the really insidious thing is, what are we doing? The government should not be issuing, certification or determining how gay you are. That's for you to be doing in the privacy of your own home. Like, go for it. But to me, it's just this ugly bureaucratization of ideology that ends up being a very kind of absurd output in the end.
It does actually contradict federal law, that doesn't it? To force
It
people
does.
to.
And
Yeah.
in fact, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, an amazing attorney named Harmeet Dillon, when she saw this story cross through her newsfeed, she immediately opened an inquiry and said, you can't do this. This is a violation of the law. You can't treat businesses differently, whether they're on race or sex or orientation. And so we'll see how that goes. We'll see if it goes anywhere. But yes, in theory, it's also illegal. But that doesn't stop them out in California. They love their affirmative action, discrimination.
Well, and another area where the law has been applied in very strange ways in California is on green issues. And a story that has bubbled up quite a lot, and particularly with the LA fires recently, was the way in which I think there was a story about firemen there had to be a proportion of minority or even disabled firemen to work in the fire services. That was one story. Obviously, lots of net zero type targets and lots of land management issues that Donald Trump actually criticized quite directly, that meant that California is already quite vulnerable to fires, was even more vulnerable to wildfires.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I mean, when I grew up in California, decades ago, Southern California was always at risk of wildfires. That's just a feature of the geography, the topography. It's very dry down there. You have these long, hot summers. You have the kind of brush that grows that naturally you'd have these big burn cycles. And look, if there's a tiny tribe of 150 Native Americans that stay to the creek beds, that's fine. But when you have these big cities with tens of millions of people, those fires can be devastating, and they have been devastating. So we did a number of stories that I think outlined exactly what was going wrong. First, the governor of California just lies. It's unbelievable. He said, we have fast tracked, hundreds and hundreds of projects, for hundreds of thousands of acres. And then we did a document request from the government of California and found that of all the promises to fast track these projects, they were still about 99% short of their stated targets, meaning that they had completed about 1% of the brush management work that they had promised, clearing the brush, creating these kind of fire gaps. The other story that came up that I thought was incredible that we reported on was the government in California is spending tens of millions of dollars training Native American shamans how to oversee fire management and essentially teaching Native American tribes how to light fires. And in some of these cases, these what are called prescribed burns, you actually burn some of the brush intentionally to prevent a larger fire in the future. The California government was requiring these burn projects to be overseen by Native American shamans who would do traditional dances and drum circles and other ceremonies to, I guess, ward off the evil fire spirits. It's not really clear the mechanism by which these were preventing fires. I think it was just a handout to the tribes, meaning the tribes are very powerful in California. Here's a way to kick them some cash. But the idea that we're delegating fire management for a complex economy to tribal fire dance ceremonies strikes me as uniquely Californian and uniquely bad in terms of the material fire management goals that have been stated and that people really need.
You talked about Gavin Newsom's sort of strange relationship with the truth there. Something that struck me about, he recently launched his own podcast. Actually, I say recently, it was last year, and he was clearly teeing himself up as a more national figure. And at that time, he seemed willing to say almost anything. Some things to please right-wing people, things to please the left of the party. He's recently made statements about Israel that I think he then pulled back, but I think he said something about supporting a boycott on Israel, presumably to appeal to the the left of the Democratic Party. He does just seem to be someone who is willing to say absolutely anything.
It's it really is amazing. And it's not just that he's willing to say absolutely everything, but he's willing to say absolutely anything with a tone and performance of utter conviction. I mean, it really is remarkable. And in a sense, he can kind of get away with it. He has that slick quality that we were talking about earlier that allows him to move on issues in a way that is totally shameless. And so, he has this unique politician advantage of shamelessness. It's not a virtue. It's certainly not a good character trait, but there is a kind of reptilian efficiency to what he's doing, a serpentine quality to his discourse that does make him more dangerous. And this is where I would part ways with many of my conservative colleagues who have said, oh, he's willing to say anything. He's totally insincere. He's saying this now. He's flip-flopping. We're way beyond that. We're like years beyond that mattering. And should it be that way? No. Is it that way? Yes. And so we can't rely on old standards of character and decorum and consistency. We've obliterated those in the last decade during the Trump era, in part because of the left, in part because of the right. In part because of social media, right? We have a less regulated discourse. We have fewer gatekeepers that can lay a stamp of authority on things. We have a more partisan and, let's say, Machiavellian politics than we did 10 years ago. And so we can lament the change. I do as well. But the idea that Gavin Newsom's flip-flopping is disqualifying. Yeah, good luck with that. That's how you're going to make him president, by underestimating his power. And so, I've gone after Gavin Newsom with these investigative reports exposing the corruption, but I've never, I don't approach him in a kind of condescending way. I actually recognize his look. I recognize his effectiveness. I recognize his power. I recognize his skill. And so, as we're going head to head with, some of the reporting, and he's, utilizing the government to push back against my team. This is really a battle, not simply a kind of a battle for this kind of news day by day news cycle, but we're really actually fighting a bigger fight. And I think he's a worthy adversary. I think he's probably at the top of the Democratic hierarchy right now. And I think conservatives would make a grave mistake to underestimate him.
Yes, and on the social media point, we seem to be living in an age of where charismatic narcissism thrives. And I'm no psychiatrist, but it seems to me Gavin Newsom quite clearly fits any definition of narcissism. And that ability to believe the lie as you're saying it is a classic narcissistic trait, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's probably right. And he has also... he's highly regulated, and that's quite different. I mean, he's extremely well regulated. There's the comparison to that old film American Psycho, Bret Easton Ellis novel, with this kind of sociopathic killer who's able to maintain this cool, cold, and calculating demeanor, obsession with physical appearance, while he is, kind of violating the moral law. And so Newsom does kind of give off some of that energy. I think the memes are right on that one. And here's the thing, though. I think that you have to have a certain amount of ego to do what all of these top political players are doing. You have to have a certain amount of physical stamina. It's actually a very difficult job. And then you have to have a certain amount of kind of walling off interiority. And so if you look at American presidents, historically, I think it was less so, but certainly in the mass media age, they are spectacles. They are under the microscope, under the camera lights, under the scrutiny of the press. And so interiority, in a way, is a vulnerability. I don't think Trump has great interiority either. Trump is a spectacle. Trump is an instinctual creature. Trump does look for how things play, right? He's always looking for signals he's like a sonar, right? A sonar hits a sound and then waits for the reflection to judge where it is, where it should go. And so Newsom and Trump both have this sonar-like quality to their temperament, to their character. They both have this lack of interiority. It comes out in glimpses. Trump has these kind of Zen phrases that emerge from his mouth that are kind of amazing. Gavin Newsom has the same thing where it's almost like unintentional self-reflection. But I think that's a symptom of the age. And in fact, someone like Richard Nixon, who actually had interiority, you read his diaries in the White House, deeply self-reflective, deeply kind of emotionally sensitive in his own way, was actually a net negative and would be impossible in the current atmosphere. And so, is the problem Newsom or is the problem us? Is the problem our society? I'm not sure it's so clear cut. I'd love to blame Newsom, but I think it's a little more complicated than that.
I think the fault's definitely with us too. Interesting. Nixon also a California man originally, but a kind of California that got lost slightly as this world that you just described with Newsom and so on, and the kind of Democratic elite took over.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, I'm drinking, I don't know if you can see it here, my Nixon's the One coffee mug from the great Nixon Presidential Library. So yeah, we love Richard Nixon, and you're right. So, Nixon's biography is kind of amazing. He grew up kind of in very desperate material conditions. His father was a kind of a failed entrepreneur, tried to run a lemon ranch on some bad land, opened a small grocery store in a small town in the desert in California. And he writes about growing up listening to the train tracks of those Union Pacific trains running through and dreaming of a life of great accomplishment. And he overcomes these really tough material circumstances to rise to the presidency. But what Nixon represented in California was that gritty pioneer spirit, the self-made man, the man who settles the rugged frontier and creates something out of nothing, the simple homespun virtues of the one-room schoolhouse. And that California is gone. Southern California has now been totally paved over, and you can't rise from nothing through the force of personality, the force of will, your own ingenuity. But in fact, you have to conform to the California political machine. And so while you read Richard Nixon and you say, this was a remarkable individual, you look at Newsom or Pelosi or Becerra or any of these people in the high parts of California's politics, and you say these are manufactured personalities that come from the machine itself. The machine is selecting, cultivating, and managing these individuals. And, even with Newsom, who of all of the other options has the most charismatic appeal, has the most individuality, small I individuality, non-individuated individuality, but that's another tangent. But even Newsom, who in theory is the most personality, let's say, what I've gotten covering Newsom is that he is not leading anything. He's at the top of this machine, and all he's doing is trying not to get zapped. He's trying to give a little bit over here, a little bit over here, push things over here, back things up over here. He's constantly, feeling the wind, trying to adjust the very surface level of the machine. But the tragedy of Newsom is that he has nothing of the great political leaders, even progressive political leaders in California history. Pat Brown, who defeated Richard Nixon, so we don't like Pat Brown. He was the father of Jerry Brown, kind of another kind of dreamer in California politics on the left. Pat Brown built California's infrastructure. Pat Brown brought California into the modern world. Pat Brown made sure that California's agriculture was second to none. You had the great Hollywood producers that built this city of dreams in the desert in Southern California. You had the 49ers in California building these great fortunes on the gold rush. You had incredible men of destiny, the Getty family that then patronized, California's political leaders. You had these great builders of this immense California dream. And now you have crappy NGOs giving free solar panels to illegal aliens. I mean, it is a tragedy of California, and Newsom is really just trying to manage this decline, manage this corruption without getting hit. And so the feeling that I have with Newsom is not one of outrage, it's one of sadness, because he really represents the decadence or the decay of California's greatness. And he's kind of a pathetic symbol dancing on top of it, trying to harvest clicks on the internet. It shouldn't be that way. He should be doing something much greater. And unfortunately, he doesn't have the strength or courage to make it happen.
Well, of course, alongside that decadence, you do have Silicon Valley, which produces its own kinds of decadence, I'm sure, but it is also an enormous driver of wealth. And I wonder about Gavin Newsom's relationship with Silicon Valley, because we had the campaign of Spencer Pratt recently to be mayor of Los Angeles, and that attracted some interest from Silicon Valley people. And there does seem to be some of the kind of richer tech overlords, if you like, who are trying to address California's problems, and presumably they hate Gavin Newsom. But what's the sort of broader perspective of Newsom's relationship with Silicon Valley?
Yeah, so Newsom has a complex relationship with Silicon Valley, and you can see his calculation evolving over time. There was a time 10 years ago, certainly during the early 2020s, when the tech sector was very monolithically left wing. And the tech sector as a whole, with some exceptions, had a deal with California Democrats, which was, let us build our companies, let us do our thing. We'll pay the 13% state income tax, the highest in the nation. And we'll give the DEI, we'll hire the HR people, we'll donate to the Democratic campaigns. And they had this equilibrium where it wasn't great for business, but they had network effect in California. They had a rich talent pool. They had the incredible weather and amenities and culture of Northern California. And there was an agreement that you don't push us too far, we won't push you too far. That really has fallen apart in the wake of Trump's 2024 victory. So you have increasing number of tech leaders defecting to the right because they see the writing on the wall with AI, with taxes, with regulations. They realize that eventually the left will come for them, will come for their companies, will come for their wealth. And then you have this gambit in California that's just making it onto the ballot, the wealth tax, which is really a confiscation of 5% of the net worth of anyone with a net worth of over $1 billion. And look, I think it's an awful tax. I don't think it will accomplish what it wants to accomplish. I think it's actually done already more harm than good. But tech leaders are realizing, wait a minute, if they're willing to just say, hey, we're just going to start seizing your wealth, not in the income tax, which is already sky high, but we're just going to start taking chunks of your wealth. This year, it'll be 5%. Next year, it'll be 10%. The year after that, it'll be 50%. And the year after that, they'll just confiscate your entire company. And so I know some folks in our circles that did a kind of survey of California billionaires. It's looking like about 70% of California's billionaires are already seriously considering exit plans should this wealth tax pass. And so you're going to get an exodus. And the difficult question now, and this is what we see Newsom maneuvering. Newsom was for the wealth tax, then against it. Now he's against it at the state level, but for it at the national level. As I was saying, Newsom just tries to manage things without doing too much damage. He's starting to see that actually the machine is kept alive by the tremendous growth of the tech sector. And so he's realizing, we may have gone too far with this wealth tax. Maybe we should pump the brakes on it. Maybe we should try something else. But which in the short term is good. Because that is the correct decision. You actually have to pull back on this. But in the long term, what needs to happen is really hit the Democratic machine as a whole, because they're not going to stop. The radicals in the legislature are not going to stop. They're going to follow that classic socialist playbook where you keep confiscating, you keep taxing until you hit that other side of the curve, meaning the other side of the so-called Laffer curve, where taxes are so high that you start actually reducing net proceeds or net tax collection, and you go into a spiral. And so I applaud Silicon Valley leaders. I've worked with a number of Silicon Valley leaders on these issues. They're starting to understand that old consensus is impossible, and they actually have to fight for the state if they want to stop not just in a self-interested way, if they want to stop the kind of onslaught against their own interests. But actually, if they want to keep California a functioning, civilized state, they have to actually push back against some of the radicalism within our politics.
And looking ahead to 2028 and a probable Gavin Newsom run, last week we had those elections in New York where three Mamdani-backed Democratic Socialists of America aligned candidates won. Tomorrow night in Denver, there's likely to be another Democratic Socialists of America victory. It certainly feels like the DSA, which was formerly a fairly fringe group even among the Democratic Party, it's becoming the movement of the party, much like MAGA became the movement of the Republican Party. And I suppose Gavin Newsom might benefit from that in the sense that he can present himself as a sort of third way in between that very radical left of the party, which is not popular across the country, and the old Democratic establishment.
I think that's spot on. He is, of course, by contrast, somewhat moderate, and and let's take kind of separate the appearance from reality. So certainly he can run in the center, and he will run in the center. He's already signaled through a variety of statements, including on his podcast, which you mentioned, this backing down from the wealth tax or proposing it nationally, kind of this schizophrenic politics where he's on all sides of all issues. He's keeping all those avenues open. And certainly when you're running in a general election, Democrats are gonna always tack to the center. That's good politics. We know that's what he's gonna do. And I guess the question is it real? Is that, where are his convictions? And again, I think there's an element of it that is actually real. I mean, Gavin Newsom is not a committed ideological zealot. Gavin Newsom looks out for Gavin Newsom. He wants to maintain his popularity. He wants to rise to power. Whereas someone like Zoran Mamdani or these congressional candidates like Daria Lisa Chevalier, who won this congressional seat on a radical left-wing platform, they're committed. I mean, you say what you want about them. I think their ideas are awful, but you have to give them credit. They're committed to an ideological program. They have the kind of courage to put it out there. They're willing to lose if need be, but they're going to stick to their beliefs to a greater extent. And so the question moving forward will be, how much could this rising DSA faction take over the party? The Democratic establishment is looking weak. It does appear that the Democratic establishment doesn't know how to successfully deal with this. They're ceding their authority, they're ceding their popularity, they're ceding even parts of their own political apparatus to the DSA candidates. And I think that's likely to continue because the ultimate reality, and you read this even in Dostoevsky, talking about the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. I mean, we're talking 150 years ago. In his novel Demons, Dostoevsky captures this dynamic perfectly. Older liberals, kind of older elite liberals who run the institutions and imagine themselves as open-minded, progressive, future-oriented, but ultimately responsible, have no ability to resist younger radicals. And so you see this generational problem where Dostoevsky writes about the kind of older liberals. This, in our case, would be Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Gavin Newsom trying to manage these young radicals, young nihilists. They can't do it. They lack that sense of authority. They lack that stability of character. And more importantly, liberalism as itself does not offer great defenses against more radical variants of liberalism. And so I think that in the short term, at least, until the catharsis and the chaos and the kind of Thermidor moment, I think that's going to continue, whether it's BLM, whether it's Free Palestine, whether it's climate disaster, whatever movement is next. They'll always be able to kind of gain a foothold within the democratic hierarchy for these almost universal patterns of behavior and generational politics.
Mm. And lastly, Christopher, Gavin Newsom, you've gone after his corruption, you've gone after his politics. I don't want you to give any scoops away, but where do you think is the most fertile area of your inquiries, and what are you going to go after next?
Yeah, great question. So we're pursuing a number of stories, a number of angles, a number of different domains, and I think what we're successfully peeling back is corruption, fraud, mismanagement. So these questions of good governance, and in all cases, California is pursuing a kind of insane strategy of governing the state that is riddled with corruption, fraud, and abuse. But we're doing a couple stories, and I'll be careful to not give away too much. We're doing a couple of stories that peel back a layer and show a bit more intimate relationship between Gavin Newsom and various facets of corruption. And so, we just wrote a piece this past week where we looked at Gavin Newsom's connections over his decades in politics. And at least 10 people who were very close to Gavin Newsom have been convicted or pled guilty to public corruption, fraud, embezzlement, stealing money, abusing public programs, etc., including his chief of staff, including a former deputy chief of staff. So we're kind of tightening the circle around Newsom. And the question that we have is, wait a minute, if all of the people around Gavin Newsom are either under investigation for corruption or have been convicted of corruption, what did Gavin Newsom know? When did he know about it? What is he hiding? And we're in a current fight with the Newsom administration about some public records. The governor is now claiming that he doesn't have to provide any public records related to his communications. And so we have a number of leads. We want to know what Gavin Newsom was doing in some situations where there are serious allegations of corruption. So far, he's been hiding those records, refusing to release them. And so I think in the coming weeks and months, we're going to have potentially some explosive revelations on a number of different angles related to corruption, totally improper behavior that could not just indict or implicate the state, but could implicate Gavin Newsom in a personal manner that hasn't been done before.
Well, we will look forward to those articles with great interest. And thank you very, very much for coming on to the Americano podcast. Christopher Rufo, a great pleasure to have you on.
Likewise, thank you. It's been fun chatting with you about all these things, and especially Richard Nixon. So for your UK viewers, if you're in California, you're in Southern California, you want something fun to do, go to the Nixon Library, the Nixon Museum. It's a great group of people. It's a fascinating experience.
Absolutely. We love Nixon at The Spectator too. So thank you very much for that, Christopher. All the best.